Namaste. This whole prasad thing in the Hindu tradition is about what we understand really as communion in the Christian tradition, and that essence of food. But the interesting thing about the Hindu tradition is it's much more relaxed. And stories around Neem Karoli Baba, anyway, in his ashram, was that he was pretty good at throwing oranges, and fruit was, people would come and offer things to the ashram and to him, and then he would distribute it right away to the people. It's kind of the anti-offering kind of system, although there were people that were financially supporting the temple. They'd bring him the food. Him, by having it, just by having it, would bless it, and then he'd distribute it. And I guess in a pretty crowded, pretty decent-sized area, he was pretty deadly with the orange. He could get it to about whoever he wanted. And then there would be candies, and those stories kind of reminded me of the boredom I felt because when I worked for the Bargain Express, I think it's called something else now, the free newspaper. And when I came back here in 1993, after living around the country, I put together like 4 part-time jobs, and one of them was the Bargain Express. And then eventually I went back to school, and I got my first church, and I decided I was a little too sedentary. So I went back to work for the Bargain Express, and I also worked for the Sentinel, and then later the Urinal Sentinel when it merged. And I got pretty good at throwing newspapers. And it's part of this, when you're doing something that's pretty boring, you have to do something to make it creative, so you see how far can I be from the porch and still hit the thing with this paper. And when I have seen pictures of oranges and other sweets being chucked around an ashram, it kind of reminded me of chucking the Bargain Express. And so I can see where it would start to be kind of a game. And yet, there's this idea that those who have nothing freely share. And the more you have, the less willing you are to share because you're worried there might not be enough. And you see it in the developing world, that if you show up at somebody's hut, you get fed. And whatever it is, and sometimes you're not quite sure what it is, but it gets shared with you. And a huge part of the Hindu tradition, what we would call hospitality, was feeding people and making sure that people got fed. And these are people that have nothing. I mean, India, I used to work with a psychiatrist who was overcompensating for, I'm sure, an impoverished youth in Ireland, named Basil Jackson, who was Jim Baker's.
I used to work for him.
You worked for him?
Crazy Basil?
Yes, don't call it Basil. He's not spice.
About crazy Basil.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
But he went to India and came back and said he'd never seen poverty like that. And yeah, the Doculum, he had the cake. What a small world.
Yeah, I know.
And he came back just sort of blown away by the poverty, and he probably grew up pretty impoverished. But if you go to India, they get you to somebody's house, they stuff you full of potatoes, because it's vegetarian, and their food, and you feel welcome. And then you contrast that sort of with that Salvation Army thing when the Salvation Army started. And it was like, well, this isn't a sandwich, but pretend this is a sandwich. And they would say, do you want a sandwich? And to hungry people would say yes. And they'd go, oh, well, you have to come inside and hear about Jesus first. And gee, why didn't that work? Well, because it was the attitude that Ram Dass is describing here, when you let the wealthy people be in charge of the distribution of the prasad, which was supposed to be for everybody and free, and all of a sudden, are you qualified or not? And hearing the story read just now, I was reminded of trick-or-treating. Last year I trick-or-treated, and I suddenly realized why I'm not really a big potato chip snacker. And this is going to make me seem really crazy, so you just forget about it after. I was trick-or-treating with Tommy Mosier. Just now his name came back to me. And I was dressed as what back in the day was called a bum. But, you know, with my mother's mascara giving me a fake beard and an old ratty shirt of my father's and some ratty jeans and a couple layers and a fishing, not a fishing hat, but one of those, I guess it's a fishing hat. Those floppy hats like that ugly plaid one we saw this morning at breakfast that guy was wearing. And somebody was giving away bags of potato chips, and this was like Score City. So we would take off part of our costumes and shove them in our shopping bag or somewhere, and then go back and get more. And our third trip back, we got caught, and the guy said, "Hey, you've been here before." And what reminded me of that story was this, when the people were accusing kids of coming back for seconds and thirds. Maybe that's why I don't like potato chips, because I got busted being a little potato chip. I mean, I like them, but just not by themselves. You're not going to find me too often opening one of those little giveaway bags, you know, individual sized bags of chips like that guy was giving away. But if we're being generous, then what does it matter if, I'm not talking about me and trick-or-treating, but here at the ashram, if these poor kids come back for second and third helpings, who cares? And then you let the Westerners get a hold of communion, and what do? Well, and we're just or I'll say we're just following the tradition, but in a way, what we do during book study is a lot more like communion than what we do during communion. You can have this little schnuppel of bread, schnuppel being a German word meaning morsel, but it's like, or, you know, this wafer that will stick to the top of the roof of your mouth, and I'm not knocking wafers, I use wafers a lot over the years, but, you know, like a piece of peanut butter, you know, this wafer is, and you throw it in somebody's mouth who's really hungry, and it goes up to the top. And I tell the story sometimes of communion in my congregational church, where I guess you can buy cubed bread that the crusts have been cut off, but I'm sure back in the day you couldn't. And so communion in the congregational church where I was growing up, the church ladies probably got these loaves of Wonder Bread. And they would cut the crusts off, and then they'd cube them so they were the size of a small dice. And you didn't go forward because, you know, you didn't want people to move around, so they would distribute it, and there was a balcony, and teenagers sat in the balcony because they didn't really want to see you, you know. And I went to the 11 o'clock service, and I got up at about 20 to 11 because it took 10 minutes to get there. And so I was pretty hungry, and communion was it was once in a blue moon. I'd never even experienced it before, I don't think. And so I had a friend with me, and they brought the communion around, and got my little dice of Wonder Bread, my little die of Wonder Bread, and I'm looking at it, and my mouth is watering, you know, this is looking like a filet mignon, you know? And I'm waiting for the little juice cups to make it through so they can come up. And the pastor finally says, "Take and eat," and I looked at everybody ate it, you know, so I knew it was time, and I went like this. And I don't really know what happened to it. It might have gone over my shoulder, or I might have been salivating so badly it just disintegrated once it hit my mouth. But I'm now convinced it like landed a row or two up on the balcony. And so I'm trying to, you know, and then I never did find it in the juice thing. And every once in a while when we used to do church in a Methodist church in West Dallas, and they do communion using those same little cubes of bread, and I'd find one like sitting in a pew, because we did it in the afternoon, that somebody had just decided not to eat, you know, and I'd think, what's this thing? But it's not exactly an image of generosity, is it? I mean, it's like, I understand it's, you know, there's a certain symbolism to it, but it's like, oh, and that prasad practice is so different. It's like, eat, eat, eat. And I thought what Baba said about, once you give it to Hanuman, and Hanuman is the monkey god, there's a picture of him here and he's over there. There's a long story around Hanuman, but basically once you give it to God, now it's not yours, and so there's no point in being stingy about it. God's going to take care of it. And maybe for all the arguments we've had about, you know, Jesus fed 5,000 with the numbers change. 5 loaves and 2 fish. And how did that happen? Were there a bunch of people that had fish in their pockets? You know, did some little kids bring sandwiches? In the end, that's missing the point. The point, again, is you give up what you have, and it ends up being enough. And the mechanics of it aren't nearly as important as the fact that it's enough. And what do people need? Well, they need food, clothing, and shelter. But to survive, they need food and water, or food and something to drink. And so when we craft ritual around that, it's just the very essence of life. And it's not using it like a manipulative tool. Oh, you're thirsty, would you like a bottle of water? Come hear about Jesus. And it's not this idea that you need to be worthy, you know. You get so worried that people are going to receive our food because they think it's ours, that we construct all these layers of stuff people have to do to be ordered to be eligible to come to the table and get their little piece of bread and their juice, instead of saying, and I'm patting us on the back, but instead of saying, you know, however you understand this, it's okay. If you feel like you are called to come take communion, take communion. And we're just so tight-assed. And you see it bleeds over into our social programs. Well, what happens if we feed these children that don't have any meals in the summertime? Maybe their parents will decide not to work. That's not the point, is it? Who really cares? Children need to eat. And so let's feed them. And trust that somehow in the great unfolding of the universe, the rest of it is going to work itself out. It's the lesson of the people who used to, and I used to know somebody who did this, but I can't remember who it was. If somebody was asking for money downtown, it was like, what are you going to use it for? Oh, come on. First of all, what does it matter? If you're giving it away, it's not yours anymore anyway. Second of all, if they're going to use it for something that you don't approve of, why are you forcing them to lie to get it? How is that different from, oh, are you thirsty? Would you like some water? Come hear about Jesus. Come do a trick. Sing me a song. Can you dance a few steps? That isn't generosity. And the wonderful thing about generosity, and what the rich people who came to prepare the prasad couldn't see, is that it's only when we really let go on our generosity, and that doesn't mean giving so much away that you don't have a place to live, but really let go and trust that whatever is supposed to happen with this is going to happen with this. And my role is to create it and let go of it. Then we get transformed in return. But when we're tight about it, and when we're saying, well, here's a little bit, we have to make sure you're really okay. Now, isn't it us, or we, that are minimized in the end? Because we put ourselves in this position where we presume that first of all there's not enough, that second of all somebody put us in charge of deciding who ought to get it, and that third of all anybody's going to be transformed by this. And so one of the things I appreciate about this group is that we've decided we still want to do communion. Because I think no matter how it looks, and no matter how we shape it, it reminds us that everybody has those very basic needs. And simply by virtue of being a human being, we're called to share so that everybody has those very basic needs met. And that's the beginning of a process that transforms everybody, giver and receiver. And it goes, maybe because it goes against our nature, it's so important, because transformation is against our very nature. We want to be tight, we want to hold on, we don't want things to change. And things change all the time, and we look around and go, holy cow, what can I make not change? And pretty soon you need the right classes, and the right clothes, and the right pedigree. And then you wonder why nothing about your ritual has meaning in it.